Welcome in, everybody. Today we have the 17th episode of the Titans of Fantasy Football podcast. Today we're going to be running through some news around the league and camps, and we're going to be going through busts. So players in our top 50 this season that we think you are going to be disappointed in. It's going to be kind of an exciting one. There's been a few episodes since we've gone through and talked about news, so we've got a slew of information to throw at you here. Caleb, you want to take us away?
Sure. Just pulling it up here. Give me 2 seconds.
All right. I'll get us going with the first one here.
Okay.
The biggest one that's happening right now is Antonio Gibson is having some fumbling problems. So the team is starting to send him some messages. He's been taking reps with the first, second, third team offense and the special teams. So they're trying to push him down the lineup, kind of send that message to him. It sounds like, this is kind of a wake-up call for him. And we're starting to see that reflect on his ADP. He's been dropping down a bit.
I guess shocking, but also like the way they're trying to show that he is versatile there too is kind of, I guess you expect, because he was a running back / wide receiver in college, and he returned punts at Memphis too. So I don't know. Maybe they're just trying to give him the ball, but it's definitely some news to look at into.
Mm-hmm.
Next piece was Ken Walker had a hernia. They didn't say what kind. If it was a sports hernia, it's usually a more serious injury. That's when the soft tissue pulls apart from like the hips down there. And it can usually is expected to be about 4 to 6 weeks recovery. He had a procedure done today, is what Pete Carroll said. So basically, had surgery on it. They do expect him to be ready by week 1, but should be ready by mid-September.
Yeah, and then a few days back, Zach Wilson had a knee injury over the weekend. He is expected to make a full recovery, and they don't expect it to be too serious. Right now, they're saying anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for recovering time. It is possible we do see Joe Flacco on the field for week 1, but we'll kind of have to monitor that situation. We haven't got a lot of clarity as to what exactly the knee injury was. Kind of bits and pieces of information here and there.
Yeah, from what I've gathered, it's a bone bruise / torn meniscus.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how he had a bone bruise, though. That was kind of confusing to me because it was a non-contact injury he cut. So immediately everybody thought torn ACL. But we'll see how that all works out. Doesn't like you said, doesn't sound like they're going to rush him back. Sounds like Flacco has looked good, and that they're going to let him possibly be the week 1 starter. But talking about another guy, big injury. Crazy how fast he's recovered, it seems like. They haven't given too much of extent on it, but Chris Godwin, back in pads last week. And now this week he is running 7-on-7s. So kind of crazy. He tore his ACL, I think it was in week 11 or week 12 last year, maybe even week 14. It was at the end of the year. And for him to recover this fast is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and everything we've heard about him thus far is that they didn't put him on the pup. He entered camp. He was doing drills on the side up till now, but it's good to see him back practicing with the team. Kind of in the same vein, another guy we've seen injured, Michael Thomas. Everything we've been hearing out of camp about him after his injuries the last 2 years is that he is fully healthy and he's looking great.
Yep.
So, based on that information, the way the offense clicks down in New Orleans with Jameis Winston at QB, we could see him kind of return to some big-time fantasy relevance. And that's being reflected on his ADP, too, as he starts to climb up the draft boards. I think early on, once he wasn't on the pup and he was ready to start the year, he was starting off maybe around ADP 75, 80, and now he's climbing into the 60s, and we'll see where that ends up by the time that everybody's getting into their drafts. I know we already have some starting this weekend, so
yes,
it's getting to be that season.
For sure. Another big piece of information today, take it as you will. He was known as a sleeper to some this year. Mccole Hardman was carted off the field. No real extent on what the injury was, but usually if they bring the card out for you, not good. I usually, like I said, not good information for his fantasy value and how he will be for that injury.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then in LA with the Chargers, we have Josh Kelly is running with the first and second team offenses as the number 2 back behind Austin Eckler. So he looks to have that backup job locked up. This is a role they've been trying to fill. They drafted Isaiah Spiller, and we kind of thought he would be the one to jump into that position. We were excited about that, but Spiller's been running with the third team thus far.
Crazy, because we've seen Kelly, but maybe the Chargers see something different this year in him. So definitely some news to look into because Spiller's being drafted as a top handcuff right now. So
And the coaches have just been raving about Kelly back and forth because he's been in the league 2 years. Typically after that, you kind of know what you got. But they said he's come to camp hungry, he's in great shape, and he's been doing all the right things.
So last piece of information here that we have for you, and kind of shocking because once this guy signed, it really hurt the other guy's ADP big time, I would say. And if this news is true, we could see his ADP start to rise again. Melvin Gordon said today, and he expects Javonte Williams to go with the starters, and he said that he is their guy. Denver views him as the guy in their offense, and so Gordon will probably rotate in as a secondary back. I've heard so many mixed rumors, though, like that it's going to be a 70-30 split, then it's going to be a 50-50 split. But if this is coming from the words of Gordon, take that as you will, but I expect Williams' stock to rise a little bit there because Javonte, given his limited role last year, he was still finished as the RB18 in PPR last year. And him and Gordon had a straight 50-50 split last year. So if he gets a little bit more than that, you would expect his numbers to go up.
Yeah, and also Melvin Gordon has been dealing with a foot injury too to start off camp. So if that's still kind of nagging as the season starts, we could see Javonte get off to a hotter start, or we could see them scale back some of the carries for Gordon.
Yeah. All right, guys. We won't let you wait any longer here. So Garrett and I last episode we covered sleepers, and those were players that were under the top 100 that in ADP that we think could be beneficial for your team. Now we're looking at guys who are in the top 50 in the current Fantasy Pros ADP, who we expect to hurt your value at what you're getting them for. Not quite live up to the, not quite live up, but not live up to the standards that you're drafting them as. That this is where it hurts you in leagues. And we picked 2 apiece, and we are going to go over them in depth and why we think. We threw out the factor of injury risk. We said, we're not going to involve that in here. We don't want that to affect our rankings of these guys. So we went off why we think, the statistics behind it. So, Garrett, I'm going to let you go with the first guy.
Yeah, and like Caleb said, it would have kind of been a lot of hearsay back and forth had we gone and speculated, this guy, if he was injured, then it could, lead to some poor fantasy performances, but that happens every single year. And guys that you think will be healthy aren't, and guys that you think will be injured all of a sudden will play a lot of games. So with that, we just want to take it from an objective standpoint of performance wise on the field. Why could these guys disappoint? So top 50 guys, we figured, that's going to hit just about every single league. These are guys that are drafted in every single league and guys you expect to be big-time fantasy performers that maybe you should have some red flags about.
Mm-hmm.
So, my first guy on the list today is the guy who finished top 2 in his position. Debo Samuel, who was number 2 last year, is going off the board at wide receiver 7. His ADP is 18th overall. So a huge portion of why he scares me this year and why I think he's going to be a disappointment or a bust. 25% of his points last year came via the run game. So that's a huge portion of his total fantasy points. He has already said when he was going through his contract dispute, he does not want to be treated like a running back, and he doesn't want to be utilized that way because that will shorten his lifespan as a player on the field. He wants to be a true number 1 wide receiver. Now, that being said, going into week 9 last year, he only had 6 rushing attempts. He finished the season with 59. He also ended the year with 8 rushing touchdowns, which also aided a huge boost to his fantasy performance. So, while that's a huge chunk of what he did last season, there's also some other factors that play into it. He was hyper efficient with his touches last year in the receiving game. So his efficiency was way too high at an 18.2 yards per reception. So if we look at all other top 12 receivers from the last 5 years, only 2 other receivers have ever had a yards per reception that high. Now, also, he did it off with 77 catches, which ended up at 1,405 yards, but he also only had 6 touchdowns in the passing game. Over the last 5 years, out of those top 12 receivers, only 3 have ever had that few of catches and that few of touchdowns. So he's not getting enough catches, he's not getting enough touchdowns and being a big factor in the red zone other than those rushing carries. So if they scale back the rushing carries and he takes a step back in terms of efficiency, you're not going to get that payback that you got last year at the wide receiver 2. I know he's not being drafted quite that high, but in the mid-second round, right now he's dead center of the second round for 12-team leagues. You're typically trying to get a guy there who you expect to be a big-time mainstay with top 5 upside for their position. This last little bit is the factors of the other pieces in that receiving game. George Kittle, we know, has been a mainstay in the passing game for a few years now. He's one of the top targeted tight ends in the league. But there's also an emerging Brandon Nayuk there. From week 9 on, Brandon Nayuk was the wide receiver 13. And I don't think people realize that because he started really kind of blossoming into his own after the season started. He started off slow. That was also during the time that,
he's in the doghouse.
Debo was kind of moving towards that rushing game more and getting 8 to 12 carries. So as they solidify with less injuries in their running game and transition to these other pieces in the offense, I think you're just going to be really disappointed with what you get out of Samuel this year in terms of where you draft him.
I like that. And like you said, about the merging Ayuk, it definitely, everything you hear right now out of camp is that him and Lance have a very strong connection. And I don't even think Debo has really done much. I haven't heard if he's been practicing much at all. I know he was in a contract dispute. He got that contract, though. He got paid. But, yeah, all you keep hearing about is Ayuk. And Kittle was injured for some games last year. So that in those games, that really impacted Samuel's usage. And you could see, like you said, a little bit of a decrease when Kittle came back there at that stretch. That's when Samuel started getting more carries than he was receptions. And like you said, the efficiency of that, just you got to expect a decrease. That just is crazy high. So, yeah. With that, I will get into my top bust for the year. And I feel like it's a pretty common one that is being talked about. And it's also wide receiver who got traded from one team to the other. And it's Tyreek Kill. His ADP right now is wide receiver 11, overall 21. So going at that very tail end of the second round. The biggest reason that I have is, even though he may say it's different, he raves about how good Tua is the QB downgrade. You're going from, no question, a top 3 quarterback in the league to a guy who has been probably just above the bottom tier, I would say, right in that 20 to 25-ish range for quarterbacks in the league. And you don't realize how much of an impact that it has at fantasy. It's shown in the past. Once you leave those top dynamic offenses, that you will see a downgrade. And his ADP has reflected it some. Hill would probably be a top 5 wide receiver if he was still with Mahomes in ADP. But for him to still be up there, it's questioning to me. Hill, obviously, we've known, has a great yards per catch. Always has. He gets these bomb routes from Patrick Mahomes, blows the top off the team with his speed. Tua Tagovailoa has one of the worst downfield percentages in the league at completions. And I don't know if you saw this stat yesterday, Garrett. It was being posted about he has less 30-yard completions in his 2 years than Odell Beckham Jr. Kind of funny because OBJ's only thrown like 5 passes, I think it has been. He let loose both times. Landry, it was, I think. But it's kind of funny to see that stat because that's, Hill is good with the ball in space too. Don't get me wrong. He's a fidgety guy, really fast, but he's meant to blow the top off the team. And when you have that with a guy who has shown he really doesn't air it out too much, kind of concerning. But also, going from the Chiefs' offense to Miami's new offense, people don't realize Hill's in a better wide receiver competition room than he was in Kansas City. His main competition for targets in Kansas City was Travis Kelce. Now he goes to a revamped, I guess you can say, Dolphins offense where he's got Jalen Waddle, Cedric Wilson, who they gave also good money to as well, a 3-year, $21 million contract, and Mike Gesicki, a solid tight end as well. And I just want to give you some target numbers here. Waddle saw 140 targets last year as the top guy in Miami. Wilson was playing over as the wide receiver 3 in Dallas, a very pass-heavy offense, and he saw 61 targets. Mike Gesicki saw 112 targets at the tight end position. When he was over in Chiefs, it wasn't even close to comparison for targets. Tyreek Kill was around 140 or a little bit above 140. He had Travis Kelce, who had 134. Shouldn't say that. Travis Kelce had a lot of targets. But this is the drop-off. The second wide receiver on that roster was Byron Pringle, who had 60. It was Mccole Hardman, who had 80. And then Byron Pringle, who had 60. Pringle actually turned out to be better than Hardman for yards per catch and stuff. But the drop-off there is just crazy because you got Waddle at 140. The next guy for the Chiefs was 83. So, right there, you expect, okay, should be some less targets coming away for Hill because you got these other guys here. Also, though, Mahomes threw 658 pass attempts last year. And that was in 17 games. So he averaged 39 passing attempts per game. Tua played in 13 games last year, and he threw the ball 388 times for a total of 29 pass attempts per game. Okay, you're like, okay, yeah, they'll throw the ball more with Tua. Now they get Mike McDaniel as their new head coach from San Francisco, the offensive coordinator. San Francisco has been one of the least throwing offenses in the league. Very run-first heavy offense. They have been they finished the top 5 in rushing attempts in the past 3 years when he's been the offensive coordinator. So that's right there is alarming. Just, for instance, last year, combined Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo in those games threw a combined total of right around 512 passing attempts. Not very high. Pretty low on the standard. So, you get a run-heavy offense, you get not a downgraded quarterback, and you get a better wide receiver competition. It's spelling a decrease for Tyreek Hill, and they're just guys who I like a little bit better around that range right now, who I feel like are safer options for sure. I feel like Tyreek has a chance to not crack that top 15 this year.
Yeah, and, at the end of the second round, it's like there are so many question marks there for a situation that, we just don't know enough about. One other point I want to make on here is that Jalen Waddle going into the NFL, he was touted as this, speedster, downfield threat, a guy who should have a great yards per catch. Last year, his yards per reception was 9.8, which is exceptionally low. Mm-hmm. So that means he's catching the ball and doing it on short yardage little routes. So he had 104 catches. That barely translated to over 1,000 yards. Mm-hmm. Where, we just talked about Debo, where he had 77 catches that got him 1,400 yards.
Yeah.
So in another offense, like if Tyreek Hill comes to town, who, last season we saw his yards per reception come down because he had an increase of targets. So if he starts to scale back on that, he was at 11.2, but in seasons past he was at 14.7, 14.8, 17 for yards per reception. So if he's getting less catches than he has, or less targets and less catches than he has before, and he's scaling back in yards per reception, you're probably not going to get the return on him that you're hoping for. And I think everybody out there can assume that there's going to be less touchdowns available in Miami than there were in Kansas City.
Yeah. Yes. I would agree with you there.
So many reasons to be scared of that situation.
Yes.
Okay, my second guy in the top 50 that I think will be a bust and you will be disappointed on is Darren Waller. Right now, his ADP has actually dropped a little bit more. He's down at 47. He's tight end 5. First, let's touch on his fantasy finishes since he's broken out. In 2019, he was tight end 6 on a per-game basis. 2020, he was tight end 2. In 2021, he was tight end 7 on a per-game basis, but he was tight end 18 overall, so he had some injuries last year. Now, another key point here is the Raiders rank in target share for their receivers. In 2021, they were 28th. Year before, 32nd, last in the league. And the year before that, they were 29th. So dead last in wide receiver target share the last 3 years. Now, what's the big change? Why are we bringing that up? Devante Adams is coming to town. They traded for him this offseason, gave up first and a second. Big move. Devante Adams should command at least 25% of the target share in that offense. He's too skilled. It's what he's shown that he's done in Green Bay, and he already has the chemistry with Derek Carr. So with his added target share, we should see a significant reduction in targets to all other players on the entire offense. So if we scale back, relative to what we've seen, Hunter Renfrow, he averaged 7.5 targets last year, which, he had kind of a breakout season. He finished as a wide receiver 1.
Yep.
Darren Waller, he saw 8.5 targets a game, but he had a booming first game of the season and then wasn't quite close to that the rest of the year.
19 targets the first week.
19 targets the first week. So without that game, his average was less than Renfrow's. It was 7.4 targets a game. So if we're going to sit here and look and try to project, with the Devante Adams coming to town and that target share being shifted, it's really going to change and create a new dynamic on this offense where I have a feeling the pecking order is going to be Adams, Renfrow, then Waller. And Renfrow during the rest of the season already saw more targets than Waller did. And in the red zone, Waller hasn't been a huge threat there. He had a good touchdown amount in 2020, but other than that, the other 2 seasons he's been relevant, he hasn't been a factor in the red zone. So Devante Adams, who is a red zone monster, is going to eat up whatever amount that was probably already there.
Mm-hmm.
So Waller might come away with similar touchdown numbers that he has in the past, but the upside for the touchdowns isn't going to be there for him to try to eat into. Really, at tight end 5, you're kind of drafting him at his ceiling and kind of what you're hoping for the end of the year. And you're not going to have a lot of opportunity for him to not disappoint you. I have a feeling most managers who grab him are really going to wish that they picked a different player in that range because there's a ton of wide receivers, there's a ton of running backs in that area, and that's kind of like a tight end dead zone right now where I would rather just wait and grab somebody later like an Ertz or a Goddard who you're probably going to end up with a similar fantasy production and you would pay 2-3 rounds higher of a price for.
Yeah, I agree. We talked about Ertz. Like you said, I would rather wait and grab a guy like Ertz. But save that for, I guess, a different talk. But yeah, I was thinking about Waller too. One of my busts. I'm happy you covered him. But it's kind of funny because the guy I'm talking about next for my bust is in that same offense, and for a lot of the same reasons. But he plays a different position, obviously. My bust is Josh Jacobs. His ADP right now is running back 22, 41 overall. So the reason, it was funny, Gary, when we did our divisional breakdowns, my pick for the Raiders was Josh Jacobs. But a lot has happened since then that we've heard about. So my biggest reason I'm fading him is, like Garrett said, with Adams in town, you're going to get improved passing attack. So he actually recorded a career high in receptions last year. So Josh Jacobs, the 2 years previous, wasn't much known for a reception guy. And then once Kenyon Drake went down with an injury last year, he started getting him more and more and more receptions. And it was kind of cool because it brought his points per game, his PPR ceiling up. I think he finished as almost like the RB8 it was, or I think he just almost cracked top 10. But you bring in Adams, and like Garrett said, who is going to demand a 25% target share, right around there. And then also, Waller was injured for some of that season too, so that could be why, at more towards the end of the year, when Jacobs was getting those receptions. So that could be part of the reason why he was getting some of those receptions too, was you only really had Renfro getting targets, and some Jay Jones, I guess, mixed in there too at the end of the year. But one of the big alarming things that happened so far this year is week 1, or preseason, when they had the Hall of Fame game, he was the only starter to play in the preseason game. And that is concerning in itself, considering they have a lot of running backs right now in that room. So it was kind of head-scratching to see him out there. And it kind of makes sense, though, because they declined his fifth-year option. Garrett and I talked about that in an earlier episode. We thought it was for the fact of you'd be paying him more for his fifth-year option than you would for the average market value for a running back. But now it's kind of like, well, maybe it's because they might be thinking about moving on from him. There's been rumors of Josh Jacobs on the trade block, teams calling about trades, and so maybe something to look into down the road or something. But like I talked about that running back room, this year they brought in Amir Abdullah, who has never been a big market name really. Brandon Bolden, who from the Patriots kind of had one of his best career seasons last year at age 29 or 30, I think it was. And then they drafted Zamir White, I believe, in either the 4th or 5th round, I can't remember, out of Georgia, big back. All we've been hearing so far is that Amir Abdullah is carving out a James White-type hybrid role. And if you don't know, Josh McDaniels came over and is the new head coach was with the Patriots, came over from Oakland. And I just wanted to hit on some key points about when he was OC in the Patriots and what that offensive style represented. So, in last year, the Patriots had 3 running backs with over 100 touches. Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, and Brandon Bolden, who, like I said, was carried over because he was Josh McDaniels. He likes him. Not a single one eclipsed 100 or 1,000 yards rushing. So, Harris was right there at like 926, but his touchdowns is what made him very fancy relevant last year. And in 2020, not a single person eclipsed 1,000 yards either. I think Harris had about 700 to 800 in 2020. Not very good. Very spread out, that offense is. And going back to Amir Abdullah, he was rested with the starters in week 1, unlike Josh Jacobs. So that, too, shows that he's more than likely going to be utilized in this offense. I want to talk about Brandon Bolden, too. It's all limiting Josh Jacobs' PPR game is these backs that they brought in. Brandon Bolden led all the backs in the Patriots offense last year in receptions. So now he's over. Could take that role over again. We don't really know. He's been a great special teamer for them for a while. He could just be back in that role. But if James White or if Amir Abdullah is getting that James White role, James White was a great PPR back and was always a scat back, third down, change of pace back. And if he does get that, that really limits Josh Jacobs to mainly first and down work. But then we see Zamir White. He got a little hype coming into the combine. Georgia running backs were always in a shared backfield, so they are never really big. Like, you don't ever see him put up huge numbers. But he was the goal line back at Georgia. He was the big dog. He scored 11 touchdowns his senior year, which is interesting to notice because if he gets even a couple of those red zone carries and hawks it from Jacobs, then it limits his touchdown value too. So it's very, very interesting to see. You just don't see how Jacobs can become this top dog in his backfield right now with all those guys there, and like I said, a head coach now, Josh McDaniels, running at the helm. It just doesn't look too great of a fantasy outlook for Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, and one point to make on that too is that they declined his fifth-year option as a first-round draft pick. So even though they have him on the roster right now, there's a good chance that they're not tied to him long term. So whatever happens during the season this year, it's not like they have to worry about his development over his fifth year in the league with the team. So they can cut ties, they can move on. They drafted Zamir White, like you said, in the fourth round. There's a good shot that they turn it over to him and see what happens.
Yeah, totally. Damian Harris was a fourth rounder out of Alabama. And now look at him in that same offense. They're both kind of the same style backs, I would say, too. So it's just interesting to see how Josh McDaniels plays this all out. I do want to give a shout-out here. I had a person who watches the podcast and listens to the podcast. I reached out to him. I said, hey, give me your guy that you pick as a bust and in the top 50. And so I had a friend reached out, gave me his bust, and his bust is a very common one too. Garrett even talked about it in the first part of the news, and I think it's hilarious because he actually owns him in Dynasty too. He's his Dynasty RB2, so it's kind of funny because it proves that it's not biased at all, and he's ripping on this guy because it just doesn't look too good for the future for him. And it's Antonio Gibson. His ADP is 19 right now, running back 19, 38 overall, and there's just been so much of Gibson, and he is just falling. And it's funny because he might become a value if he keeps dropping. But right now, I still wouldn't draft him where he's at. I don't know if you're that same way, Garrett. I don't like where he's at right now.
Yeah,
especially with the rumors out there stirring, and
yeah. I think one thing that's going on right now is the media is looking for stories. So if we're sitting here hearing that Antonio Gibson's up there playing with the third team, playing with special teams, dealing with fumbling issues, media is going to run with that.
Yeah.
But it could just be that, like we said earlier, the coach is trying to send a message, get your act together or get booted down the line.
Yeah.
So Gibson, right now, like where he's at, he's ahead of some other guys who are pretty talented. I would be reluctant to pick him where he's at, but if suddenly he's falling into the 50s, all of a sudden he's along guys like
Danders,
A.J. Dillon, J.K. Dobbins, like range where it's like, those guys are a little more, they have some more question marks. Dillon's the number 2 and Dobbins has his injury problems. So he's, all of a sudden, if he ends up in that group, it's going to be a little bit more intriguing because he might finish decent as a fantasy player.
But that's where it seems like he should be right around right now. Like you said, where he's at right now currently, that's what puts him in this bust category. And I do think it fits well. It's confusing. You want to see Gibson. He's showed that he's good when he gets the ball in his hands. And you were hoping to see him be this dual threat guy. And it just hasn't gotten there yet. And you thought this was the year at the end of the year last year. McKissick's a free agent. Woohoo. They're going to let him run with the offense. Nope. What do? They re-signed McKissick to a 2-year deal, who has proven to be a very viable pass-catching back. That's strictly what he does. And then they go out and they use a third-round draft pick on Brian Robinson, a big bulldozer of a running back from Alabama, and it's just like scratching your head. It's like, so what's Gibson going to do?
Yeah,
you take away his first and second down role, and you take away his pass-catching role. So you're handcuffing him to. He's still probably going to be that top back in the offense, but it's going to be a 3-headed monster. And it's come out before, what's his name? Ron Rivera said he sees this, and we talked about it before. He sees it being a D'Angelo Williams, Jonathan Stewart type backfield. You hate to hear that as a fantasy owner. And it's just crazy, like I talked about how Gibson's fall. Garrett, after the season started, or after the season was over after the Super Bowl and Dynasty Draft started taking away, he was ADP 8 at running back. He was the 8th best Dynasty because he's pretty young. I think he's 24. But this just hurts him because those guys are going to be at least there. Well, McKissick's there for another 2 years now, and Robinson's there for 4 years. So you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel right now for Gibson. It's dimming.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of reasons to be scared, and I told you right away. I'm like, I had Gibson as a guy on my short list that I was considering as a bust. That being said, I had one other guy that I was close to putting on my list. The problem is, I don't think he's going to truly be a bust where you're going to be so disappointed. I just don't like where he's being drafted, and I don't think he's got the upside.
Yeah, he's been overdrafted since after year 1, I think.
Yeah. So the guy we're talking about is Terry McLaurin. Right now he's ADP 39, going as the wide receiver 14. His best fantasy finish, he's had wide receiver 25, wide receiver 21, and wide receiver 28. Never broke the top 20, and he's being drafted way ahead of that right now.
Yep.
Carson Wentz, is in town, and while he has had some decent passing seasons, last year as top receiver, he had Pittman at wide receiver 15, but before that, the 2 seasons before, Greg Ward at wide receiver 59, Alshon Jeffrey, wide receiver 59, 2018, Alshon Jeffrey, wide receiver 26. Those are all not great number 1 fantasy targets for the wide receiver position. And they went out and they drafted a high first-round pick, Jahan Dotson, who is dazzling in camp right now and showing flashes as a potential breakout. Yeah. Terry McLaurin has been a good player out on the field, and they haven't had the best passing attack. But I don't think that there's enough reason that you should be drafting him way ahead of where he's ever finished in fantasy.
Yeah.
I think he should be more scaled back, get him around the Brandon Cooks, maybe even a little further range where you get him more around pick 50, 10, 12 spots back.
He's finished as a low-end wide receiver 2 every year, and right now you're drafting at the very top pinnacle of wide receiver 2 range. There's a big difference there for points per game. And like you said, you're drafting him at where you hope he finishes, basically. Yeah. And I do want to point out, you pointed out Pittman's wide receiver 15 season. Great last year, Pittman was, with Wentz. Pittman's surrounding cast was way worse than what the Commanders have right now. His wide receiver 2 was T.Y. Hilton last year, who battled on and off injuries and was 32 years old and just didn't really have it anymore. You have Jahan Dotson, I think was picked 16 in the first round. And then they also have, we'll see how he plays with injuries this year, though. Curtis Samuel's there still, too, who 2 years removed was a 1,000-yard receiver over in Carolina. And so you have him, and then you have second rounder from last year, Dwayne Brown, still there too. And there's just a lot. There's a lot of variables there with McLaurin. I do think Terry McLaurin's going to be a good wide receiver. I agree with you though, Garrett. I think it's too high. I am not comfortable taking that where he's at. I think who was the wide receiver right after him right now in current ADP? You can get him right around Jalen Waddle, Deontay Johnson, DJ Moore. The 3 guys below him are PPR monsters. I think every single one had over 140 targets last year, actually. Waddle, Johnson, and more. So. Yeah,
all the guys that are going around him have also finished right on that borderline wide receiver 1 range. Because right after him is also DK Metcalf and Mike Williams, who I think Mike Williams, what was he, 7th or 9th?
Wide receiver, I think he finished at 8 and Allen finished at 10 last year.
Yeah, and we've seen great seasons from DK Metcalf. It's man, why are we drafting McLaurin just at his ceiling so stinking high?
Yeah.
You're putting undue expectations on him. And, for a guy that a lot of people like to root for, it just seems a little unfair.
Yeah. Yeah, not ripping Terry McLaurin as a player. We all like him as a player and what he's come as, but I think he's got the talent. He just never has had the quarterback play. That's his biggest thing. He's never had a good quarterback. So
yeah, and if you guys have never read into it at all, Terry McLaurin really has an awesome story. a guy who fought for, everything he's gotten thus far in life, everything he's gotten thus far in terms of playing time, both at Ohio State and now in the NFL. It's pretty cool. But, yeah, hate the ADP. Don't hate the man.
Yeah. And with that, guys, I think that's going to wrap up today's episode. We just it was tough. We don't have a whole lot of guys to cover for bust, but when you only pick it from the top 50, you don't have a whole lot to choose from. Draft season is right here at our fingertips. We're going to keep pushing on content. We're hoping to get 2, sometimes 3 podcasts a week. Give you guys some good information about who we like, who we don't like, some upcoming news, upcoming stories, and we got some good topics coming up. I'm really excited for next week's topic. Garrett, I'll let you discuss what that is and what we're going to be covering.
Yeah, so the next one we have is our breakouts and league winners. So these are guys that we expect to take that next step, that level up, and then guys that, you might not have in the first or really early on, but guys who might win you your league. So it could be anywhere in the draft. Yeah. So a lot of impact potential players out there and guys you're really going to want to hear about on our next episode. With that being said, though, we're going to check out tonight. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.